So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining Design Charcha. This is Sadea's biannual series, and then we have several series, and Design Charcha is one among them. I'm Archana Shekhara, and I'm the chair of Sadea. Joining me is Amrita Datta, who is our vice chair, and then Nipuni, who is also our treasurer. So, thank you so much. They are board members. And then we have several other members joining from Sadea as well. And firstly, I want to thank Randa for doing this for us. So really appreciate your time, Randa. So what is Design Charcha? Design Charcha series manifests in the form of open conversations, presentations, collaborations, and dialogues. Charcha translates to discussion, debate, or discourse in several South Asian languages. This series aims to bridge the gap between transcontinental perspectives and research by inviting participants from beyond the South Asian diaspora. So Sadea invites practitioners from diverse disciplines, including designers, filmmakers, artists, animators, educators, and cultural and creative workers from around the globe to share this expansive intellectual space. So again, thank you, Randa. And I have the pleasure to ask my colleague, Amrita Datta, to introduce Randa. So please, Amrita. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Archana, for that brief description of Design Charcha. So, Randa, where do we start? So, Randa Hadi is a Kuwaiti designer, researcher, architect, and informal archivist who uses her positionality as an Arab immigrant to explore the interweaving of themes related to Arab identity, belonging, and representation. Her work is deeply rooted in visualizing the multiplicity in narratives for clients like the New York Times, Airbnb, the Brooklyn Museum, Storefront for Art and Architecture, Fry Art Museum, Cooperhood Smithsonian Design Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Art Gallery of Ontario, whose recent exhibition catalog, What Matters Most, Photographs of Black Lives, was awarded AIGA's 50 Books, 50 Covers in 2022. As an associate partner at Polymode, she is interested in getting lost in the archive, uncovering, unearthing, and inspiring her design practice that is nuanced, detailed, and multivocal. Randa received her MA in graphic design from North Carolina State University with her thesis, A State of Betweenness, narrating transnational family history through a dynamic digital archive. Her BA in architecture from the University of Miami, and is a producer and educator for BIPOC design history. So thank you so much, Randa, for coming in and sharing your thoughts with us today at Sadea.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm gonna share my screen so we can go ahead and get started. I gotta make sure that I'm sharing the sound. Can you all see my screen okay? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so again, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited to be spending time with you and sharing some of my research around archives. I feel like if you know me on a personal level, you know that I can't stop talking about archives. So I'm excited that I have the time to be sharing some of my work. Before I get started, I would love to give a land acknowledgement. I'm currently based in Los Angeles, California, on the unceded lands of the Chumash, Kitch, and Tongva people. I have a long presentation, but I'm going to try my best to wrap it up and save some time at the end for Q&A or just for us to chat. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about during this chat. So I'm going to introduce myself, give a little bit of a positionality, give a little intro on archives, and then I'm going to show a couple of projects that I've been working on. I'll start off with my thesis because that was really the seed for all of the work that kind of comes after that. Before I formally introduce myself, I'd love to introduce my grandmother. I usually start off my presentations this way because I think so much of who I am is because of her. So my grandmother, Jawahar Abdullah Ibrahim, immigrated from Iran to Kuwait at the age of 14 when she became an orphan. She moved to Kuwait to be with other family members who took her in as their own child. And that same year, my grandma got married to my grandfather. And I think because of her personal experience with her own family, she really held strong family values and loved really deeply. She was an incredible wife, a mother, a grandmother, and a great grandmother. She welcomes everyone into her home, and it doesn't really matter how far removed you were from her. She opened up the doors to her house for everyone and loved everyone equally. And I think my love for food and the sharing of our histories came from her. To me, she was one of the greatest storytellers that I've ever known. She would be able to look at a photo and tell you the exact moment that the photo was taken, contextualize it. In a lot of ways, this presentation is dedicated to her and to her storytelling spirit. So I'm Randa. I come from the desert. And I come from a small country which is nestled in the Persian Gulf, where the air is super, super hot. And when I say hot, I mean really hot. And the winters are really dry. My people are pearl divers, fishermen, and weavers. The Bedouin women have been perfecting the craft of feminist weaving for centuries. She weaves rugs, homes, saddles, pillows, and is the timekeeper. Our neighboring countries are Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq. I spent 17 years in Kuwait, and in those 17 years, my education was very centered around Western histories with a couple of classes on Kuwait history. So you can assume, and you'd be correct in doing so, that Kuwaiti design history wasn't necessarily part of my education or curriculum, which is why I have a passion right now to really dig into those histories and kind of share them. As Amrita mentioned, I moved to the US to pursue a degree in architecture and then a master's degree in graphic design. And now I've been in the US for 12 years. And I started to realize that when I moved here, what I was craving were stories, and specifically my own family stories and design histories that I wasn't familiar with or felt like I didn't have access to. I wanted to share some images of my family and the types of photos that we would all be super excited to share around the living room or dining room table, which is also the background that I have on Zoom right now. There's images of my grandmothers, Jawahar and Sadiqa, my grandfathers, Abdullah and Ibrahim. And then there's photos of my aunts, uncles, cousins, parents, my sister, my brother, and everyone in between. I think family has always been a thing that's grounding for me. And I promise I'm sharing this for a reason, because I think that, the family archive shows up in a lot of my work, but I wanted to just give you some context to get a sense of who I am, my positionality, and my background, because without all of these people, our stories and our histories, I wouldn't be who I am today. So this is a quote that I go back to often from Eric Kietler, and he says everyone is an archivist. And I feel like I really appreciate how straightforward it is. I think we're all archivists in one way or another. We all take pictures on our phones. Sometimes we create albums, we take screenshots of things, we curate digital boards on different platforms. And because of that, we're all archivists, whether that's intentional or not. And I'm going to be sharing some projects that are centered around archiving. And the practice of archiving, I think, exists on many different planes. Today, I want to focus in on the personal and the communal, since a lot of my work sits on these axes. So first, the personal. The personal for me is research-based. So it's time that I spend gathering, uncovering, collecting, writing, and pulling things together. What I'm showing here is an arena board that I've been curating for a couple of years now, and I've been adding things to it. It's called On the Act of Archiving, and it contains a lot of research references. Some of them are digital archives, quotes, imageries, and other archivists as well. And the other aspect is the communal part. And what I mean by communal is just really the collaboration that happens when you are building archives. And for me, it's my parents. I don't have direct access to my family archive because that's back in Kuwait. So I'm constantly messaging them on WhatsApp. I'm like, can you please send me photos of things? And then, of course, as they send pictures, I ask them questions, because Sometimes I'm unsure of who's in the photo. I also ask for specific stories around when images were taken. And I think communal can also mean a lot of different things, right? It can also mean community contributions to an archive that's been built. But the personal and communal is what you'll see come at play with the projects that I'll be sharing. And these screenshots that I'm showing of the WhatsApp conversations are conversations that I had with them ahead of this presentation because I needed some photographs to put in here. And my dad was sharing like 100 images of things that he's also collected. So again, like just kind of going back to the idea that everyone really is an archivist. I'll talk a little bit more about the class that I took with Jeffrey U. Warren, but I'm really inspired by his work and his approach to archives. I want to read this quote by him where he describes archiving as relational reconstruction, which focuses on the potential for a multifaceted remembrance and correction through relationships between the experiences partially represented in the archive and today's parallel experiences in minoritized groups. It acknowledges the limitations of the archive as a means of accessing erased moments, experiences, and spaces. So really, what he does is center the personal experience, which doesn't often come or doesn't often play a role in institutional archives since it's been mainly centered around subjectivity. Most information and archival knowledge within those institutions are objective or matter of fact, right? So what Jeff is saying is that he uses a lot of the personal experiences and that kind of comes into the archive as well. For me, my interest in archival practices is specifically in the realm of Arab design, culture, and society, and how this connects to my work and projects that I've done. I use my own family history as inspiration. It shows up in a lot of my work and experiences as an Arab immigrant living in the US. But I'm also interested in storytelling. And both of those things, archive and storytelling, I think they kind of dovetail against each other, but they've manifested itself in many ways, but mainly in the form of writing and visual work. So I'm going to be sharing specific archiving projects and talk about the process and what I went through and how it kind of all came together. So the first project that I'm going to be sharing is my thesis from grad school titled A State of Betweenness, Narrating Transnational Family Histories Through a Dynamic Digital Archive. You'll notice that there's parentheses in the title. For me, it was meant to denote transnational family struggles to remain connected between two spaces and places, something that's close but not close enough. As you can imagine, the thesis was pretty formal, both in the way that it was written and presented, but I kind of want to make this a little bit informal and more conversational. But I'm going to share the questions that I was kind of grappling with, the research questions that I had. You'll see that I've highlighted the most important aspects of the question, which was really to try to figure out how I can design a three-dimensional family archive to promote representational belonging for transnational families and create an immersive storytelling experience. So growing up in Kuwait, I heard family stories pretty often, again, at the dining room table, in the living room. I was surrounded by it constantly. But when I moved here, I really was missing them and I was craving them because I had no longer had access to them. So I was kind of thinking about how to recreate that experience if someone was living far away. How do they access their family archive? These were the sub-questions that I used to help guide the visual studies that I was doing. I'm not going to read through these, but I want to make sure that the archive, again, that I was building reflected the narrative structure that happens, informally when we're having a conversation, something that can hold input from various people to add a story. And lastly, that the aspect of time was something people could navigate through. So the research questions themselves guided me to make sure that the visual explorations were concise, but I also used frameworks to guide the making process. One of the first frameworks that I used was the narrative ecology of self, and I adapted it to showcase the nesting of stories within each other. I was really fascinated by the way that we as human carry stories, that we are also made up of stories. We hear our parents, our grandmothers, our friends share stories about us and with us, and those stories then become part of our identity and our fabric. So the narrative ecology of self breaks down these stories, and it includes personal stories and experiences, but it also includes the stories of friends, teachers, partners, the stories that exist in the cultural realm at large, and then lastly, family stories. So I think we contain multitudes, right? But when I say cultural stories, what I mean is things that are happening in the world right now. And I'll talk a little bit about that too and how that influences my work. But just to kind of touch on that. The other framework that I used was a blend of multiple frameworks put into one. That's the multimodal digital storytelling, which explains the kinds of information needed to tell a story using imagery, text, audio, as contain factual, cultural, and information. I also looked at the construal level theory, which places the self at the center. So basically, you become a reference point to an event or a story. The narrative characteristics that you see in orange, these are the kinds of stories we hear and tell. A collaborative storytelling approach is when I start sharing a story and then my sister jumps in to continue, someone else comes in, so on and so forth. So it's collaborative in the way that we tell the story. And then lastly, there was the honeypot effect that I looked at, which maps out the different kinds of engagement someone might have when they're walking through a spatial configuration, because again, I was interested in the 3D aspect. I had to adapt some of these frameworks to fit within the larger framework that I was developing, but I hope this gives you a sense of how I was navigating and thinking about transnational family archives. So now that I've given you a little bit of background information on the questions and frameworks that I use to guide my visuals, I want to walk you through some of the design portion of the archive. And I'm going to show some of the process work as well. The exploration phase for me was a combination of taking notes in a dedicated notebook. I feel like I like to be very organized about my notes, and just kind of making things on Illustrator, Rhino 3D, and even making things with my hands. Because I was interested in capturing oral stories, I started to map out the experience of sharing a story from start to finish and how someone might re-experience that in a digital space, especially because, again, the people that I was designing for are people who live far away from home. I was thinking about how one encounters it, how we might add to it, similar to how you might do that at a dinner table with your grandparents and sharing a story and then chiming in. Writing out more scenarios really helped me identify what kinds of designed objects someone might use, since some of the scenarios included someone reminiscing on a story that was shared in the kitchen, wanting to add to something, or seeing a photograph that they had taken when they went back home. I was playing around with the idea of an app, a holographic object that has audio. So I was really open in terms of what technology I was going to use and I wanted the design to respond to the scenario instead of the other way around. Some of the scenarios that I had written out were from my own experiences, and others were inspired by other transnational and immigrant students at NC State that I had done interviews with. A lot of the exploration started off looking really conceptual and abstract, but I wanted to map out what a collaborative storytelling experience might look like and using different shapes to represent that. I think it was challenging to think about the visual representation of a story and what that might be outside of, what we're familiar with, like a book form, whether it's a comic book, a children's book, an illustration. But at its core, I was asking myself, what do oral stories look like? Are they organic shapes? Are they fragmented? Are they perfect shapes? What are even perfect shapes? Or are they imperfect? Because we always tell stories slightly differently depending on who we're talking to, right? So those were some of the questions that I was asking myself during this process, which is what pushed me to really widen my explorations. I started translating some of the sketches that you saw earlier into 3D objects to get it to a refined level so I can really critique it and try to understand if this is something that would be intuitive to understand. And in this design, I was looking at the fragmented pieces that would then tell a whole narrative. So they all kind of exist within the same dimensional space. But after doing this study, I realized this was a little too abstract for me. I had to go back to the drawing board and think about the form of this again. So what you're going to see in the next couple of slides are explorations of how a story might appear, and they're going to be short videos. But here what we're looking at are nested spheres as a way to experience family stories. So this was inspired by the narrative ecology of self that we saw earlier. So you have Arabic text sitting on top, and then you're kind of going in and out of these like spheres which have images. That was kind of the study that I was doing, and just thinking about what it might feel like if you were someone who was like walking through these stories that are embedded within each other. This next one is a collaborative story that's been being visualized using archival imagery from my family. So here I was thinking about the fragmentation, the different pieces that kind of come together to create an integrated whole. It has complexity, but it also is simultaneous. So again, thinking about coming in and out of the sphere, what it might look like. Again, I think it's still very much abstract and conceptual, but I was trying to also grasp my head around visualizing the stories themselves. This last study that I did was a cooperative story. So in a cooperative storytelling approach, each person shares their own experience. So you take turns sharing the story uninterrupted. You share your full story and then someone else shares their full story. So each sphere here is representing one individual narrative shared by one person. And you'll see that throughout this process, I'm using both Latin and Arabic. Arabic is my first language, so I wanted to make sure that that was also present because that was the most realistic for me. There's obviously a lot more explorations and experiments that I worked on that I'm not going to be showing. I'm happy to share the link if people are interested in seeing more of those. But again, just giving you a sense of what some of them looked like. Everything that you have seen so far was a seed and a block that led me to the next step. If I had done different experiments, that would have led me somewhere else completely. But during my thesis, I was also trying to let go of any misconceptions that I had while I was making things. I think it's okay to make things that are speculative and out there at the beginning and trying to critique it because I feel like archives typically show up in a very specific way. And I was trying to reimagine that. The images that you see here are final. And I put that in quotes because I don't think anything is really final. I think my thesis chair, Denise, would always say, nothing is ever final. It's just due. And I really resonated with that as someone who's just like constantly trying to tweak something. So here I'm representing stories using organic forms where text, images, and annotation exist in the three-dimensional space, and they all sit within a time axis. You can see the time axis a little bit better from this perspective where the stories are kind of falling into place as people are sharing them, and they all sit in relation to each other. Some of them contain images, some of them contain text, and this is just kind of a side view of what that might look like as someone is speaking or sharing a story. And this is the last visual that I'll show from my thesis project, but this is how someone might interact with and read through the story. It's very layered, it's complex, it's messy, because as we all know, design history itself is also really messy. So I was trying to think about ways that I can contain that in a digital archive as well. And then the things that you see in yellow and blue, those are annotations that people are making to a narrative. So we've got family photos, we've got text that's kind of being overlaid on top of each other, and then colored organic blocks as well. Honestly, when I was doing my thesis, I didn't realize that that project would become a thread for all of the work that was going to follow. What I'm showing here is a collection of writings and visual pieces that I've created that stem from archival practices, immigration, and community archive, which again comes directly from my thesis project. And there's a couple of writing that I've written in the past couple of years relating to reclaiming archives for collective imagination, why community archives are a radical approach to archiving, and a piece about home, or as we say in Arabic, bait. I'm not going to have time to talk about all of the pieces I'm showing, but I want to focus in on the Futurist article. Again, my work is not just visual. There's an aspect where I'm really interested in writing about archives. I was part of the Against the Grain Fellowship at Futurist, which is a design, feminist, and a politics platform. I want to give a little bit of a summary of what I was trying to get at with my writing. My goal was to reimagine how we might approach and create an archive and ways that we can reclaim it. And when we think about traditional archives, often institutional, they have their own archiving process, which relies on an importance hierarchy, meaning if something isn't deemed important, they won't archive it. So the writing is partially a critique to that process, and the other portion is dreaming, imagining, and writing up a different archival future. I'm showing digital collages that I created for the article that were kind of scattered across, using, again, my own family archival photos. I've abstracted them, I've colorized them so that the faces are a little bit more abstract, just for my own family's privacy, along with Arabic poems that I wrote that are placed on top. In these visuals, I really wanted to center the photographs themselves and the Arabic language to subvert the hierarchy, because we often see English as the most prominent, but here it's placed at a smaller scale and it's secondary. And I just want to touch on the typefaces that I used very briefly. For the Arabic, I used Lifta, which is a bold protest typeface designed by a Palestinian type designer, Umayma Dajjani. And then for the Latin, I used Queer Roman Times, which is a queer interpretation of Times New Roman that was designed by Queer Graphic Laboratory. There are so many projects and examples of archival imaginaries that exist. This is one that I was interested in writing about. And again, remembering that the article was also going to be archived, I thought it was important to talk about. So in the midst of attacks on Palestinians in May 2021, there was a digital uprising that started on Twitter. People were making posts accompanied by the hashtag غرد كأنها حرة, which roughly translates to tweet like it's free. So I feel like this was a really great example of archival imaginaries or different archival futures. I'm going to describe some of the photos. Some of them are here, some of them I don't have screenshots of, but there was a person who described a beautiful train ride from Beirut to Haifa, while the other person shared a picture of a yellow Palestinian railway ticket. And it said, "Waited all this time to harvest olives with my dad, and he's telling me I'm not picking them right." There's also a tweet with a photo of an elderly Palestinian holding the key to their old house, to which they have finally returned to. There was also this photo that of an airplane window framing a luscious landscape. And there's also other photos of Gaza's international airport that had a luggage sticker that said Gaza on it. And then lastly, there was a photograph that I had seen of Edward Said's tombstone with a note that said, "It's now free, can you believe it?" And I think there's something really achingly beautiful about archiving the present while still imagining a free Palestine in the future. And these were simple archival photographs that were slightly edited, that had one sentence that described a liberated Palestine. Another huge inspiration for me when it comes to reimagining archives is Morsheen Eliari's work. She is an Iranian new media artist, activist, educator, and curator. Her project, She Who Sees the Unknown, is an archival project that centers queer monstrous figures from the Quran that she reimagines. But in order to get to the archival material where she's pulling all of these figures from, there are obstacles that you have to go through. Specifically, they're coded messages that are given to you in Farsi and Arabic. That's her way of protecting the archival documents and only giving access to native speakers as a form of safety. Because as we all know, information is power. And if this lands in the wrong hands, that can be catastrophic. So I just thought that that was like an interesting way to provide archival documents while still keeping it for people who are, native speakers to that language. So the work that I've shown so far has mostly been personal, but I want to switch gears a little bit to show some professional work. I work for BIPOC Design History. I've been a producer, educator, facilitator, and curator. BIPOC Design History is an alternative educational platform, and we're really interested in highlighting marginalized and oppressed voices in design history and making sure that students and educators have access to this information so that people see themselves existing in design history. Because often we're like, do I exist? Where can I find this information? And again, our goal is to rewrite design history courses to center marginalized figures, particularly BIPOC and QT people. And we do this through synchronous and asynchronous lecture. Again, it's really about making sure people have the tools and the knowledge around design histories that form our identities, because it's important to have access to them. But what I'm going to be talking about specifically is the archive portion of BIPOC design history. So this was in January 2021. You can see the chat. There's a lot of things happening on Zoom. We're thinking about ways that we can archive all of this information, because we noticed that the Zoom chat had such incredible gems and resources and references. People would be like, oh my gosh, this reminded me of this song. This is an article that I was reading yesterday. This is a movie that relates to this. So again, thinking about how to provide access to this to people who were in the class. Again, people were so generous in the things that they were sending. I wanted to make sure that that was like preserved in some way. Being the archival nerd in the group, I was like, I will take this on. I will figure out a way to kind of compile all of this. So the first iteration of this archive came in the form of a spreadsheet. So as you can see, the spreadsheet is broken down into each of the lectures, and then we also had tags for the types of media that was being shared. From the very first iteration, we've included the names of the contributors to highlight them as active members of the classes and to make sure we're acknowledging where the resource is coming from. I feel like often that gets missed or it becomes invisible, but we wanted to make sure that, again, they were highlighted in that way. Again, the Zoom chat was a really magical place where knowledge became accessible and it was shared openly and freely without any sort of hesitation. For the second iteration of the resource archive for the Latinx course, I was reflecting on what wasn't as successful in the first iteration. It was, I think in the spreadsheet, it was a bit hard to decipher or to search through. The spreadsheet itself was also massive. There was a total of 108 columns and 127 rows. So while it definitely looked cool, the usability of it was a little difficult. And everything in the spreadsheet was manual. I had to type all of that in or just like kind of copy and paste from the Zoom chat. So for the Latinx course, we moved all the resources to a Notion database where the sources were then tagged more efficiently and you were able to filter through the kind of content that you were looking for. So that felt a little bit more streamlined. And then this is the current form of the resources. We created a new website that launched in the summer of last year. So we've embedded the Notion resources directly onto the website for everyone to access, whether you're a student in the classes or not. That was something that we were actively working towards because the previous versions were only accessible to people who purchased a class. Earlier this year, we got asked to contribute to an exhibition titled Baltolo, which was an exhibition about meaningful, open, experimental, and forward-thinking practices in graphic design education in Burgundy, France. And so our contribution involved activating and bringing forth some of the resources that we've gathered into a zine. So it became a portable resource guide, and we pulled resources from all three of the courses that we have. This is a small ongoing project that stemmed from a class that I took at the School for Poetic Computation earlier this year titled Relational Reconstructions. Jeffrey, you, Warren, and Dree were the two instructors of the class. We spent a lot of time discussing archives and how we might recreate them in some way. So I want to show what I had been working on. So as I mentioned, I've been gathering family archival photos for a while, but this was really the first time that I was activating it in the 3D space. I built a portable archive paradise by stitching several archival images together to create a room or a scene and adding props to it to tell a cohesive story. I lost both of my grandmothers in the past couple of years while being here in the US, and that was really challenging, not being able to go home, which is why this archival practice that I've cultivated has been important to me, because it really is healing. I often center them and I'm constantly inspired by them. And you can see them. They're the two figures on the left sitting side by side. So this is the last project that I'll share, and I'll try to make this quick, but this project, Stories from Palestine, How to Build an Archive, emerged out of the need to provide access for displaced transnational and immigrant families to feel empowered in reclaiming, documenting, and sharing their own stories that have been erased. And when I started building this project as part of the Decolonize, Divest, and Create course for the Useful School, I was mainly thinking about designing templates that would selfishly hold my own family history. But after the Israeli occupying forces' continuous genocide on Palestine, the format shifted to address what was happening in the world, because that couldn't really be ignored. So I used this as an opportunity where the templates for the archive are going to hold the vibrant, rich, and beautiful history of Palestinian artists, poets, families, and architects that have been collected from various archives. How to Build an Archive is essentially a network and an ecosystem that allows for several entry points into the archive. That way, it's diversifying the number of portals and serendipitous stumbling upon of the archive. I started off this project similar to most. I was mapping out archival images that I had found around specific themes that you can see: food and cooking as cultural care and maintenance, family histories as an ontological security and self-reflection, existing in the betweenness. There's a portion of Swana histories, chosen family and community as a healing practice. So these were some of the images that I had been looking at and just kind of used as a reference starting point. One thing that the research led me to was looking at postage stamps from the Swana region. To me, I was really fascinated by the way that these design artifacts can transcend time and literal space because of the way that they travel. They go beyond geographical borders and boundaries. I think there's something also really unique about their scale and how much information they can contain. Something else that was important to me is thinking about the kind of work that I do and how it serves the larger community. I obviously currently live in the US, but I really want my work to go beyond the West to talk to my people in the Swana region. This specific map was created by El Idrisi, and I was first introduced to this map by Shireen Sallah, who was also in the Against the Grain Fellowship with me at Future S. And something that's really fascinating about this map is that El Idrisi points south in the north direction, and north is south. There's also no geographical borders that outline any of the countries, so it almost feels like a shared space, which I think is also really interesting to think about a map in this way, where right now everything is about the borders and the lines and making everything kind of, really prominent. There's also this poster by Burhan Karkutri, Palestine Lives, or Ashat al-Thawra al-Falastiniya, again, because I was thinking about centering Palestinian archives within what I was making. It was important for me that, I also dig into Palestinian archives as well. His posters show a lot of concern, activism, and awareness of the political happenings that were, during his time. So this poster was in 1985 and 1978. He really dedicated his life to speaking about Palestine. And I've just been reflecting about how we respond to things in the moment. But again, this has been a fight for liberation and freedom for a really long time. So I knew that it was important for me to, again, decenter myself and center Palestine in what I was making. What you saw in the previous slides was not an extensive view of the research that went into this, but again, just very kind of like scratching the surface. But because of the complexity of the materials that I was looking at and interested in engaging with, I knew that this project had to take several forms. And I didn't realize this only until like pretty late in the game, that I needed several entry points into the archive. And because I was thinking about access, I wanted to make sure that people were able to contribute to the archive. They were able to go to the websites and see everything. So when we talk about access to the archives, there's often barriers or obstacles that prevent someone from engaging with it. Take, for example, sites like JSTOR or other archival sites where you need a login or credentials to see any sort of information. I wanted to make sure that, whatever I was making, people didn't really need to pay anything to make an account, and just kind of keeping it more open access. This is the current view of the website. It has these steps on how to build an archive. It's non-linear. It's also using terminology that's not often found in archival practices, because it's not about extraction, but it's about healing and reconnecting. I'm also using the visual metaphor of stamps, because again, that was kind of like my inspiration. And the site itself has information relating to the project to contextualize it. So anyone who's coming into the project knows what my intentions are. So this is also like a collaborative community archive project, and it contains a lot of articles, some image references, and just again, kind of centering the Palestinian narrative and story. Another thing that I'm personally obsessed with as a Virgo is Notion. I knew that pretty early on that I wanted to build a template that people could duplicate to empower them to document their own family history or really build any kind of archive. So again, anyone can duplicate this template. They can fill it in with whatever story they want. You're also able to filter through some of the tags that I had put, like photographs, oral story, text, or resources. And anyone can also add directly to this Notion page that I've also made. And lastly, the most exciting part of this was making a spreadsheet version of the archive that anyone can add to. Everything you see is editable, and anyone can add to the archives, with the exception of the website, just because that's a little bit harder to give access to. The idea is that this is a community archive that's living, evolving, and expanding as time passes. And each medium that I shared contains different information too. So there's cross-linking that's happening where people are in the spreadsheet, they can get linked to the arena, but no two pieces of information ever live in any of these components, because I wanted to make it like exciting and just kind of like, when you're digging through an archive and you find something, kind of keeping that feeling. And I think the biggest question for me is to figure out what's next with this project. I think that there's so many possibilities with this, so many ideas that I have brewing. But one thing that I'll share is that I'm looking at the potential of printing out the spreadsheet archive to create some sort of community quilt out of it. And in this image, you can see I had printed the spreadsheet, and there's something really beautiful about having a tangible, tactile archive in your hands and the way that that just kind of feels. I've compiled a list or a collection of some resources that I thought might be beneficial, places to go into rabbit holes, because I personally love doing that, spaces to explore, and then to get lost in some readings. And just as a note, the typefaces that I'm using for this presentation are Halyard by Joshua Darden, Diamano by Colophon Foundry, and Mola by Roberto Rodriguez. Thank you so much for listening. Shukran jazilan wa mashkurin. I've placed my information at the bottom if you want to catch up at some point, have a chat. I'm always happy to connect. And if anyone ever wants to geek out over archives, I'm also happy to do that. I don't know if we have some time maybe for questions and things. Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen just so I can see everyone. But yeah, thank you again so much for inviting me to talk about archiving.
We do have questions. If anybody's interested in asking a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can also type on chat as well.
Well, I just wanted to thank you, Randa, for what a beautiful presentation. And for context for the other folks here, Randa was my first TA in college, and it was just really nice seeing a holistic view of like the thread through all your work. Seeing it this way was just really lovely. And um yeah, I tried to like put in the resources, but you already have had a whole list ready. So I'm so grateful for that because I'm going to go on rabbit holes. But yeah, I mean, you already covered like what your next steps are, but I guess I wanted to ask, like, would you ever consider like going into like academia as like a professor and teaching like a whole course on this? Like, I feel like I would get back into school just to be your student on this topic.
Thank you, Karuna. I mean, I think that I would definitely be interested in teaching a course on archiving. I don't think that I would go into full-time teaching just because I do love being in design practice. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I would love to, if the opportunity presented itself, I would love to teach at, maybe one of those like alternative educational like platforms. I know I mentioned two, like the Useful School or the School for Poetic Computation, because those do center education specifically for BIPOC and QTPOC people. So I think for sure, I think, archiving I think is really important. Just like making sure that this information is like passed down generations and people have access to it. So yeah, if it presented itself, I think I would definitely say yes.
Randa, you've taught us all about how it's important archiving our own histories, and some of us are doing it, but then also some of us haven't figured out how to disseminate it. And then listening to you, I'm sure lots of us are feeling, okay, this is how we can do too. Thank you for sharing your contact information. I assume some folks will be talking to you and asking you to guide them. And then you're being very generous with us with your time and presenting. So we appreciate that as well. Like as a Sadea member, I appreciate you taking the time and sharing all this amazing work that you have been doing. So we really look forward to seeing how you're going to navigate these. Because some of the stuff that you're saying, Randa, people haven't even heard of or even seen. Here in the West, we really are not familiar with what's going on in certain countries in the Middle East. A few countries, yes, we are very aware of, especially Iranian graphic design. Most people are very aware, right? And Riza Abedini, like really leading the way, and then so many people following. But then some of the smaller countries, we don't know. And then, so thank you for really connecting your own history from where you're from, and then how things are happening to you, and then in terms of design as well, and also connecting through family. I think sharing those family stories are so important for us to understand who we are as a human being and also as a designer. So thank you so
Yeah.
much. Yeah.
No, thank you so much for sharing that too. I mean, there's this podcast, and if I try to find it, I will send the link to it. But there's a podcast that Jeffrey U. Warren did. I think it's called Tangents by Out of Architecture. And he talks about how, I feel like people have a misconception about, if your work is too personal, that no one would be interested in it. And I don't think that that's true, right? Like, I think people are interested in it because there's so much information to gain from someone else's history, because that becomes then like a larger narrative or history. Like, just as an example, a couple of years ago, I started asking my dad about Desert Storm because he was a prisoner of war during that time. And I was asking him about his experience because there's not that much information in terms of like the Kuwaiti narrative. You can definitely find that information when it comes to the West and the US kind of coming into Kuwait and, doing horrendous things to people in Iraq. That's definitely out there, but you don't have the smaller histories or the smaller narratives. And so I made a video because my dad sent me multiple voice notes because he was excited to share that story, and just I kind of like stitched it together. But I've been meaning to finish it. That was just like part one, and I think I'm trying to think about doing part two, because I do think it's important, and there is a lot of interest in people just learning about histories that they're not necessarily familiar with, even if it's not directly related to them.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, that's an important point that you're making, because not everybody realizes that sharing these autoethnographic stories are also important, because that's what inspires and it becomes design. So we bring our histories into our design. So yeah, thank you for saying that. Yeah, some of us are doing it too. So I'm
Yeah, I'm
sitting here
excited
being
to
like,
see.
yes, yes, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, keep me updated on the archival projects that people are working on. I would love to take a look. I'm always interested to see how people think about archiving their own histories or whatever it may be and how it gets represented.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that you're also an inspiration for many young designers who are practicing or who are interested in practicing, but you're an inspiration for those that learning never stops. No matter where you are, it still keeps going even as a design practitioner. So thank you for sharing all these thoughts, and especially how you've connected design practicing and storytelling together, and you're still doing it.
Yeah, definitely. I have this running joke. I tell my friends, like, if I could, I would be in school forever. But that's definitely not sustainable. But that's why I feel like I've been seeking other, alternative like classes, because they exist. There's so many out there and they're so interesting. Like the topics that they teach, like I think obviously like education is so important. And just like you said, Amrita, like learning never ends. Just because you graduate doesn't mean that you stop learning. There's so many things that you like encounter. And I would just like encourage people to, yeah, look at other classes. I mean, there's so many online classes right now that people can like look at. A lot of them offer scholarships, which is great. But yeah, I love learning. Love being in that space, because I think, I mean, when I first went into practice, I really missed being in education, because I think education provides such a important and amazing space where peers get to have conversations. You're chatting about things that you're interested in. You're also learning from other peers. It's not just learning from the professors or the educators themselves, right? Like the students themselves then become pastors of knowledge. And that's something that I had really missed. But once I started seeking, other classes and being in those spaces and just honestly meeting other people within the space, I think is really nice.
Thank you. I'm looking at time. It's 1:03. Thank you so much for your time, Randa. We really appreciate sharing your thoughts, you sharing your thoughts here in this space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Randa, for joining us and all of our audiences as well for joining. And we will release this video pretty soon as well. And so people can watch, folks who have missed for whatever reason they couldn't join. But appreciate your time, Randa, and all the best. And we'll keep following your success and many more success. So thank you again, and you all have a wonderful afternoon and evening and a great fall semester. So thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.